developing countries are places where good infrastructure needs to be built, but also at the same time where money needs to be used in the most efficient way so that you can have the most funds to prioritize human development in the ways that we value much from open government. We also tell you that necessarily developing countries are places where corruption is rampant. That being said, given the context, we're giving you 2 points coming out of open government. First, we're going to tell you why the privatization of these companies necessarily makes for these industries to be far more efficient and far cheaper. Secondly, we're going to tell you why we think that oversight over corruption and abuses becomes far better at the point at which private companies are taking over these businesses. First on the model, and I'm happy to take any clarifications. We're going to say that 1, currently publicly controlled industries such as utilities, airlines, and stuff will now become private. That is to say that there'll be 2 regionally kind of portions. That is to say that your water utility will now be placed into different regions. So you get X, the contract can be opened up that you have this region to have. Or if you're an airline, you can have these flight routes and stuff. The government can distribute these contracts. And 3, we necessarily say that keeping within good faith practices, as is done with most countries that have a privatized system for utilities and such, there'll be regular renewals of these kind of bids. Let's just say yearly to start, but I think we're kind of flexible with the concept there necessarily. Any clarifications on that model?
Yeah. Sure. So things like railways, for example, they should probably be consistent. So would you give that to only one company?
No, we still would break it up. We think we can do this in best practices as far as you have rails operating on different sides of the country. Yeah, we think that we're going to do bigger regions. So you don't have a thing like the New York City subway system where it's one company runs this, another company runs the next rail. We'll probably do it regionally so that it can have cohesion. But yes, certainly we're going to make sure competition exists on our side of the house. Cool. Moving into our first point about why we think this is necessarily far more efficient and far cheaper, and then why that's important in developing states. So why do we necessarily think that first this will be far cheaper for the countries to have in this thing? So another status quo note here that these kind of government subsidized versions of this, where a government owns this industry, are very expensive. That means that whenever there's losses, the government usually bails out the losses, and most of these companies none of these government controlled companies necessarily do operate under a loss, which is really problematic in developing states who need those funds for other things like making sure that education exists, like making sure that social benefits exist, like making sure that people are having welfare to eat in a lot of cases, right? Why does this get a lot better? 1, we tell you that these private companies are able to attract more capital in the first place. That is necessarily because it's a lucrative opportunity, but also you're accessing foreign capital markets in a way that domestic companies can't. Why? Because in some cases, yes, this probably will be some foreign companies, but also domestic companies. And also we think it's a lucrative opportunity for those investors in the first place because they can see a higher return on the profits than investing in a government company, which is usually closed off to this kind of outside investment in the first place. 2, though, we necessarily think that these are groups that are going to cut costs in the first place. Why? Because they have profit incentives. That is to say that at the point at which you want to get returns on this, it is in your best incentive to make sure that you're operating this contract in the cheapest way possible, right? So that you can make sure that it's not very costly. More, the government doesn't have to take on any expenses because it's been outsourced in the first place. But lastly, we necessarily say that they're going to be very efficient industries, necessarily because they have this competition. Insofar as the contract can be renewed, and mind you, in the model, we say that necessarily the contract renewals will be dictated by elected officials. That is to say that, insofar as you control that region, there will be a bidding process. If there's any clarifications on that too, I'm happy to take it. Yeah, no. Necessarily, we tell you it's going to be a lot cheaper, largely because of the increase in capital investment, but also because of the competition, which makes it so that these groups are going to compete down to make sure it's cheapest, and because the people who are owning the companies get a higher return on profits. That's why it's cheaper. We also think that necessarily it's more efficient as far as high quality. Why? Because it tends to be that these firms don't offer just domestic talent bases. It's far easier for a private company, because they can come from internationally, because they can do this sort of thing, to necessarily bring in talent from international know-how. That is to say that necessarily they're going to have better talent for building up bands, better architects, that sort of thing, in a way that governments, which tend to be nationalized, can't hire in the same way. But moreover, we tell you that there's a different incentive structure here, wherein there's intense public pressure put on these kind of companies to maintain these kind of statuses so that you think. So what are the ultimate impacts of being more efficient and cheaper? I think this is especially important that the money is saved. Again, because as I've hinted at, it's really important in developing countries that we necessarily have more funds to help people on a very daily basis. But secondly, I think that we need really well-built infrastructure that can really come from the expertise of the private sector that public officials in public trading companies don't necessarily have the same kind of talent access to. Why? Because rebuilding these big infrastructure processes comes at huge environmental costs. For those of you who maybe know about like dam building in China, when it was done by government ministries that didn't have access to foreign talent markets, like dams were built in the US, this came as huge environmental costs because they were built faultily, there was corruption involved, and then for years after, there were improper water streams that were brought through. This comes at a very high environmental cost. So once it does break, rebuilding it again just comes at an insanely high cost for public companies, as opposed to private companies which save them all this money. But what's our second point? We say necessarily, in addition to saving money and having better built infrastructure, we get far better oversight. 4 reasons why this is the case. First, we think that penalties having to do with lawsuits, that is to say that if you're polluting or anything like that, are existential in a way that aren't for governments, right? That is to say that if it is a company that's owned by government and they operate a huge lawsuit, they get sued for abuses, they know that they're going to get more budget allocation, they're going to get bailed out in a way that these private companies do not. So they're very highly incentivized to not do that. 2, there's increased public skepticism in a way that doesn't exist for government countries. That is to say that if you are a national airline, if you're a national utility, that is something that has patriotism behind it, that is domestic, versus a private company, which, let's face it, as debaters we know there's a lot of skepticism towards them. We think necessarily this leads to increased checks on these when the contracts come up, to end their contract, to make sure they're forced out. 3, we necessarily say that alternatives are readily available. So if they screw up, someone else is coming in, so there's a huge incentive to have oversight. But lastly, we think there's less cronyism. So maybe that's second, but first I'll take closing.
What matters not is how expensive it is to build the infrastructure, but whether or not people can afford to buy water and electricity. You're effectively giving companies monopolies within regions, so why do goods get cheaper?
We necessarily say you can still legislate price controls on these sort of reasons insofar as they're public utilities. That's exactly how it works in the United States, for example, on electric bills and utilities. I have no idea why that wouldn't exist here in developing countries. And I think it's even more likely because we think there's less cronyism that would be used to drive up prices. Why is that necessarily the case? Because note here that in the public version of it, it tends to be appointees who run these sort of things. So there's a connection between the individual running the company and the person who has their direct oversight. This is not necessarily the case when an outside private company goes in. But I think more importantly, there's an increased incentive to have cover-ups in the case that it is a public company. Why is that the case? Because at the point at which is that it is the initiative of the government, is the initiative of a specific politician, and there's a scandal created, that comes directly back to bite them in a way that doesn't happen for the private company. If there's a scandal with the private company, you give them the axe, you force them out at the next possible meeting, right? But if it's the public official, that is a scandal that kills the rig. What does that mean? That means more cover-ups for corruption. That means more viability of systemic problems going unnoticed, which leads to the aforementioned environmental catastrophes. Look, panel, if you want to save money for countries that need it the most and reduce the possibilities of corruption that have devastating effects, vote Gov.
I think Prime Minister, I have to call upon the leader of opposition.
I'm going to do 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'll characterize to you how these privatized companies look like and provide you a comparative on why the state running these things are still ultimately better. Secondly, on how this leads to this means that the poor, or this leads to either poor being unable to access these goods, or it being of extremely low quality. And thirdly, on how we think that this will lead to impede on the human capital development of these developing nations, right? But before that, a few responses to Prime Minister. So the whole thing, they talked first about private companies are so much better because you can attract foreign buyers, right? We think that's precisely the problem because you allow for individuals who are not necessarily aligned with the country's interests as a whole to now gain control over how your state-owned enterprises are made, right? Then you talk about the idea of competition, right? We think it's perfectly possible for countries to go, for those state-owned companies to go, for those private companies to go into oligopolistic practices, right? We think it's perfectly possible and it's extremely hard for any sort of competition law to effectively curb that. But then they say that you can bring in international talent, right? Look, we don't really understand why this is exclusive to their side. We think how governments informing forming how their infrastructure is created can oftentimes employ like frameworks or experts from individual international organizations to aid in the development or creation of those infrastructures, right? They can also presumably hire for like talents from private companies to aid in the construction and maintenance without them being like central parts of the system. But then the last thing is that there's degree pressure from the public, right? We think say that's comparatively higher for government officials, right? Because note that if you're a company that you can simply, it's much easier for you to relocate to another country. It's easier for you to like have alternative systems of gaining capital, right? Whereas for government officials, if you're like found to be a corrupt individual, we think it's much likelier that your reputation will be ruined for a much longer time, right? Because individuals associate you by name as opposed to your company. We think it's easier for those things to be escaped from by virtue of you moving your company elsewhere, right? Moving on to my substantive, right? Firstly, on how we think these private companies work. Obviously, there's the profit-driven incentive, right? But more importantly, who we think will be leading these privately owned companies who take care of state enterprises, right? We think that these are either rich people within the country, right? Rich people within these developing nations who don't really have an incentive to care about the little person, to care about the poor people in that country, right? But the second case, which we think is even more pernicious, is where you like allow foreign investors precisely what they want to do to come in and buy like state enterprises on your state. Buy in the state enterprises, right? We think that's particularly bad, right? What we think the counter model that we have is we'll have governments adding in more legislation, more checks to ensure that the extreme harms of corruption will not happen. Right? We think that's something reasonable that we can implement on opening opposition. Right? Why we think that is ultimately really works out, right? What we think happens when you have rich people within those countries taking care of these state infrastructure, right? Firstly, we think it's highly unlikely that they're going to be care about a fair distribution of resources, right? They're more likely to benefit their own elites, or they're more likely to cooperate with foreign interests to ensure what is beneficial for them in the short term, right? We think that they're less likely to be able to be more accountable, to care more about a wider spectrum of society, right? But more importantly, not until six. Then we think that it's even worse for rich foreigners because it means that like these individuals are more likely to be caring about their domestic interests back in the developed country, right? We think what's more likely to happen is that they're going to aim to extract resources from these developing countries at the expense of the good, the good quality of living for people living there, right? We think that's particularly bad. But what do you think the comparison looks like, right? No, we think that on the comparison, governments are likely to be better than private companies because they're accountable, right? They're accountable in a very direct sense. In that, if you are unable to fulfill your promises, you're more likely to be found out and vote out in the next election, right? We point to that this is something that's more integral, more intrinsic to these to government officials than to companies, right? Because there are alternative methods for them to survive. But secondly, right, we think governments are more likely to have stable financial resources, right? We think that the fact that you have tax revenues is more likely to be stable, comparatively more stable than the sort of revenue you get from these private-owned companies operating these infrastructures, right? Which I'm going to move on to my next point, where I explain to you why there are extremely high initial costs, which simply cannot be recovered in the maintenance of these infrastructure, right? But thirdly, we think that we point to the fact that these oftentimes governments can rely on frameworks offered by international organizations to help prop up the infrastructure to ensure that they're well done, right? Okay, moving on to the second point. Why we think it's ultimately not going to be very profitable as opposed to what open government says. We think that most of these projects are likely to come with high initial costs, right? What do I mean by this? We think that for example, when you're trying to develop a railway or maintain a railway, you have to first buy land from people, and then the land prices from those regions that you're buying from are likely to see increases in land prices precisely because of the fact that you want them, right? And more importantly, right, when you have to create utility companies or sell an entirely new infrastructure, we think you have to create whole new networks of power generators, which are also extremely expensive, right? We also want to use the fact that, for example, maintaining hospitals or schools, these are extremely unprofitable projects for these companies to take part in, right? Because most of these individuals in the country are necessarily not the wealthiest. Therefore, you cannot really extract that much resources, that much of a school fee from them, right? What do we think is the impact of this? No, we think what's likely to happen is that either in the case where these privately owned, private companies who are running state resources do not choose to charge consumers, you're going to lead to extremely low quality, right? We think that's harmful in terms of human capital development, right? But if in the case where they really charge individuals or consumers in the use of these things, right, or we think it's going to be inaccessible to the poor, right? Because we know to the fact that the charges are likely to be exorbitant fees in the course of managing these things, right? We think that what is likely to happen is that you limit the social mobility of the poor, and in the fact they're less likely to be able to now access other forms of moving up, right? For example, if there are high costs on using road fees, it means that they're less able to access things like jobs in the urban areas, right? It means that if you have poorer hospitals, you're less likely to be able to to get sufficient degree of healthcare, and you end up spending massive amounts of your money on maintaining your health, right?
Why would a railway company that wanted to make money make the prices of tickets too expensive for 95% of the population.
We don't think that's a fair characterization, right? We don't think they're going to essentially price out everyone, but they're just going to make it sufficiently expensive that it's that they're able to afford it, but it's going to come at the expense of a huge amount of their monthly income, right? It's going to mean that they have very little living expenses left at the end of the day after they spend it all on these utility companies, right? But the third thing that I'm going to bring to you is the idea of human capital development, right? We point to the fact that these private companies simply have very little incentive to give high quality human capital development things, right? For example, like hospitals and education. We think that most of the times it's extremely hard for them to build up really extremely good infrastructure, right? What's likely to happen is that you lead to a world where it becomes massively more difficult for you to for these local companies to start up. It becomes much harder for them to attract foreign direct investment over or to go into any sort of specialization or to move forward to the next phase of economic development, right? It becomes much harder for these individuals to have a sufficient degree of education, or in the worst cases, right, where private companies choose to spread through their own agenda or their own business interests in the form of education, right? We think these things are particularly harmful because it means that they're in this a way in which they ensure that these business companies, these businesses have continued power over the country, right? So I brought you three things in my speech. Firstly, how the characterization of these private companies in comparison with governments. Secondly, why we think they're massive initial costs relies back for the poor. And thirdly, why it leads to words of human capital development. More than proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, and I call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Two pretty straightforward points in this speech. Firstly, why private actors have a much larger incentive to cater to historically neglected markets within these nations, why it's particularly relevant for developing nations, and secondly, expanding completely on the benefits of corporate efficiency, or why companies have incentives to make these things efficient and affordable. Let's talk about opposition first. Three extraneous points to follow. Firstly, Op paints a picture on oligopoly. Op paints a picture of a world in which oligopolistic behavior is implemented at the regional level, in which corporations are engaging in this type of action at the regional level in order to implement these types of practices. We think this was simply dealt with very clearly by my partner's model, in which he spoke about contract renewals. That is to say that if a corporation or corporations are engaging in these type of oligopolistic behavior at different aspects, that means that their contract has been renewed fairly frequently to get to the point where they are able to engage in these type of practices in the first place. If they actually do engage in the type of these practices, it's the case that either A, they will be broken up by the government, which has that oversight mechanism very clearly, or they will simply stop renewing the contract. We have no idea why they would continue renewing that contract, because at the end of the day, the people in power are answerable to the voters or answerable to higher authorities in systems where it's more authoritarian, in which there's a system of direct control. We think that that means that these companies are not incentivized to engage in this type of oligopolistic behavior. We think that's key. Secondly, they say that they'll jack prices. This will lead to things being less affordable. This will lead to companies price gouging people. We don't think that's particularly a bit of a problem. Why is that the case? Firstly, we can set price controls clearly at the federal, state, or local or municipal level. We think that's really, really key. And secondly, as Closing points out really rightly in a POI, they have a massive incentive to make these things affordable to many people within those markets. We have no idea why, if you are a corporation that is coming in as a foreign actor and have significant scrutiny by the local population because you are coming in as a private corporation rather than simply being part of the government, why you would not be facing significant scrutiny, why that wouldn't lead to public outcry if they did engage in this price gouging, why the corporation would not want to engage in more ethical practices. I think it's pretty clear. Lastly, three responses to corruption. They say that companies will be an attempt to engage in all sorts of terrible practices. They mentioned resource extraction. They hinted at others. We think that that fails to engage with the case as set up by my partner when he spoke about how these corporations have substantially less incentive to engage in these types of corrupt behavior. Why is that the case? Well, we think in many cases the third-party oversight that we spoke about already acts as a checking mechanism against that. But there's three reasons beyond that. Firstly, lawsuits are existential for these corporations, meaning that if they engage in these types of practices that engage in resource extraction, that means that they will be kind of screwed ultimately, right, by the individuals in those nations who are likely going to be very unhappy with the fact that this corporation is exploiting them for all that they're worth, will likely sue the fuck out of them, and then drive them out of business, or at the very least get their name in the headlines everywhere, meaning they'll never get a contract anywhere else within that nation. It will be an international scandal, and it will reflect on their reputation for a long period of time. But even in those other cases, we think there's simply an entrenched skepticism that results from the corporations coming into these nations and being privatized in the first place. We think in cases where it's a foreign actor coming in, or in cases where it's an actor coming in from a corporation, even at the federal level, this incentivizes good behavior to a huge extent because they're non-local, and incentivizes the government as well to scrutinize because they're going to want to pay attention to the type of individuals they're granting contracts to in the first place in order to ensure that these individuals do not cause problems for their nation, for their municipal government, so they don't get voted out of office by the individuals who are skeptical of these corporations to begin with, disincentivizing the behavior. Lastly, if all else fails, the government can simply switch their contract with another corporation. I have no idea, given that they appoint these heads that, as we stated, that this doesn't solve for the problems that open competition pointed out. Let's talk about why private actors have an incentive to cater to everyone on the market, because that engages really cleanly with the second point of rebuttal being integrated from the right now. Private actors fundamentally have an incentive to serve many individuals in the market that have been historically neglected in developing nations, as they have a key profit incentive. Unlike the local government, these corporations are more likely to serve those individuals. Why is that the case? We think that government actors at the local and municipal levels in these cities are inherently more intent on backing their own political constituents and doing things that will keep them in power rather than other things. Why is that the case? Firstly, they're answerable to their constituents in elections in many cases, or in countries in which there are autocracies, but they have systems of involved power, they are answerable to the higher authority, and so they're not placing their constituents first. They risk offending a higher authority, which is likely to be thrown under power. And thirdly, governments in countries, in developing countries, like their counterparts in developed countries, often exist in a state of segregation, meaning that certain authorities will prioritize certain regional blocks of countries to begin with and neglect others. That means that certain municipal powers are disproportionately disempowered vis-a-vis others. Given that this is true, what does this mean at the point at which a corporation is coming in and choosing to invest in these regions? It means that private corporations have an incentive to cater to those historically neglected markets. We think in many cases this exists as a form of passive discrimination, where the government doesn't want to spend money on certain regions or neighborhoods centering on an ethnicity or class which has faced historic discrimination. The impact of this is that when the corporation comes in, this discrimination is countered or offset by the corporation having an incentive to cater to that neglected market, because there's likely to have been less competition there in the first place, because there's likely to have been less services in the first place, because the municipal government is dramatically underfunded compared to other areas that have greater wealth. Why is exploitation in this case fundamentally not a problem? I already told you about price controls. I already explained to you how in cases of railways, these individuals have an incentive to make them affordable for those individuals. We think because they will have an incentive to cater to those individuals, this will drive prices down into their region and attract more companies to come into historically dispossessed regions, which means that at the point at which competitors are entering the market, they will be incentivized to drive down prices to make these things more accessible to the individuals who previously were shut out from that. We think that's incredibly key in countries in which there has been historic discrimination, in countries in which certain municipalities exist at a greater wealth disparity vis-a-vis others.
This argument is that governments don't care about rural and poor areas. Your mechanism for holding companies accountable is that governments will renew contracts because they don't want the population to protest against them. But you're also telling us governments don't care about rural and poor areas.
The issue is passive discrimination, where they are incentivized to fund corporations in those countries or fund public utilities in those areas because they don't want to spend money to eat in their bottom line. Obviously, they don't want people suffering in their country to a massive extent. If that happens, they'll be called out for human rights abuses, obviously. Don't paint the most negative picture of our model here. What we're saying is that these individuals are likely to pay passively discriminate against these people to a huge extent. They're likely not to have funded them in the past to a massive extent, which means that given that they would cost them money to do so as a public utility, they're more than happy to outsource it to these private corporations, which attracts more investment, which attracts more investment to those areas, drives prices down, makes it more affordable, increases the level of economic power in that country dramatically. We think that's incredibly key. I think that answers that pretty clearly. But what did Templeton tell you? He also told you in his speech why we get fundamentally more efficient companies, because they say that these corporations are not going to be as efficient fundamentally. We think we attract substantially more investment from foreign actors, which are incredibly key here. We note the scrutiny mechanism I already built in, so these foreign actors already have an incentive not to mess things up. You also just get access to a much greater talent pool on our side that's fundamentally than any other individual could. Why is this the case? Because the types of companies that are likely to want to fill these types of lucrative contracts that are being set up on our side of the house often tend to be the companies that have access to those greater pools of talent. We think they save governments money on balance, and they lead to increased investments. Moreover, he told you that it leads to less incentives to cover up corruption in the first place. On their side of the house, where local officials are able to cover up rampant corruption that again discriminates against minorities to the maximum extent, when they have direct control over public utilities, they're likely to cover that up. In cases where there's mechanisms of oversight to watch these corporations and regulate them, it's far more likely that these things get exposed out into the open and the contracts enter into a better company in the long term. Because this leads to less discrimination against the most vulnerable, because this leads to lower prices, greater access, very proud to propose equity.
I think the Deputy Prime Minister and Mr. Papa, the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
developing nations need to make a trade-off, right? At the point which they have to trade off in between economic development in terms of numbers and bottom line, saying things like we have more money in our entire GDP versus social welfare. First thing to note, right, is that we think the corruption is at best a wash under their side. Because they said, you can use things like contract renewal and there'll be perfect implementation, and therefore we could be able to capture like any time a company does something wrong. If that is true, it means government officials are doing their very best job. There are no things like corruption happening, i.e. these foreign companies won't have an avenue in order to be corrupt, to buy their way out of doing bad things. But secondly, we tell you that even if you have checks on foreign owners, right, you can also have checks on government officials, i.e. if the government can function in that way under their side, it can function the same way under our side. And at this point we tell you that we are way, because we give you three analyses to why government officials will be more checked than foreign owners, right? A, we tell you, the government officials are literally prone to election, i.e. if the people see they're doing a bad job, they will kick you out. Look at Najib. Two, we tell you that at the point which these politicians, right, do something bad, they are bound by the national law. I.e. with foreign investment, the worst that will happen, you get something like a fine, whereas the person who made the decision lives in freaking United Kingdom or like say the USA and doesn't really get any actual harm, right? This is what happened when the Gopal, like in Union Carbide chemical accident happened. None of the activities were actually pardoned, even though people's lives were literally lost. What we tell you is, ultimately, you get better instead on our side, where you can literally do things like jail people for corruption. Moving on. Let's go to the rebuttals, right? What did DPM say? A, basically, let's look at PM, right? So basically, PM basically said this, right? Like, A, that it's efficient, right? Because you can dispute contract, if you don't like it, you do a bad job, you can pull out a contract. What does this mean? And the promise should tell companies that you can pull out contracts anytime. It means the companies are going to be very short-term profit incentivized, right? If you give contracts on a 2 or 3 year basis, they're going to make sure that in the 2 or 3 year basis, they're going to make as much profit as possible. What does this mean? Short-sightedness means they won't develop infrastructure, right? If you are a railway company, you are not going to make a new railway to some place that need a railway. You're going to jack up prices on existing railways. They say, but you will want to make some profit, so you won't jack up too much, right? A, we tell you, we will only jack it up to the point where if the consumer is willing to trade off the price of railways versus other things like food, because they needed the rail to get to their jobs, for example, we think those things have to happen. Two, they then say, well, you know what, you attract more foreign buyers, and therefore, that's good, right? A, again, profit incentives mean, at the very best case, you get foreign buyers coming in, pumping capital, making profits, lifting the capital back to the foreign countries, which is why we see there's a capital drain from developing countries in the very first place. We think that foreign investors are really bad. Second of all, they then say, but then there'll be best incentive to be cheap, because, if it's cheaper, it's great, and things like that. Even if they are true, even if they are correct, right, that there's an incentive to make the price of products cheap, it will come at an expense, even if they don't increase prices, come at the expense of things like reducing wage, those are the things at an expense of not developing infrastructure, which we think is the main priority in developing countries. The reason they are developing is because they are not developed yet, so the first thing you have to do is develop. Moving on, the third thing you then say is like, you need good infrastructure, foreign governments are good, foreign people are like smarter than like development sectors like local people. We think that's bad. A, we tell you, at the point which you form an oligopoly, at the very best case, the government is held hostage to the conglomerates, right? I.e., it does a national railway that is owned by one company. That company can say, give me the continuation of contract, or I'll literally pull out without giving you things like a buffer time, etc. B, even if you break up, as they say, the companies, right? What that means is, because each of the companies now hold a smaller chunk of the railway, they are unable to do things like massive government national level development infrastructure, which is ultimately going to be a comparative that we get, because we are the only one that can still do that, right? But secondly, we tell you that at the end of the day, right, the comparative is you can prosecute the local people if they do a bad job, because you can either hold it under national law, or second of all, even if the company screws up, you still own the capital as national government, because the money of the entire company stays in your country. So even if it screws up, the money have not went abroad in the very first place.
Many places in developing countries just do not have access to these services at all. How does the government finance building the infrastructure in those areas?
Simple. We take taxes, we take trade-offs from one company and use the pool of all state-owned companies, taxes, taking resources, etc., to fund certain infrastructure projects that are important. Things like national grid, railway, electricity, that's how we do it. Under their rule, these companies at best will take out the capital anyway. We don't think they're going to do that on their side. Moving on to DPM. They then say like, oh look, you know what, basically, you can set price controls, right? We tell you that if you set price controls, Nobody is going to want to invest because they cannot make a profit. But secondly, at best you get bad service, bad products because they will produce a service in order to get a profit under your price control. Second of all, they don't say, you know what, there are lawsuits, right? But look, again, there are lawsuits that still happen on these local companies owned by local people under national law. We know it's an exclusive thing that they ultimately get. So the last thing they say is like, oh look, you have intended to cater to the marginalized because of three reasons, right? Because basically there's competition and basically like an unexplored market. A, we tell you, there's a high entry price. You need to literally build things like a road, for example, to enter those markets. It's already a high cost. B, we tell you, the marginalized are poorer people. We don't think companies that are profit driven would want to cater to a poorer group of people because there's no profit anyway. Third of all, we tell you, we get watching under our side, but at least under our side, we can get the electoral pressure from this group when they basically do collective action and lobby the government to give some form of resource distribution to them. We think for those reasons that we should win this debate. Now moving on to basically the rest of my case, right? We tell you that ultimately, developing nations, they make trade-off of development or social welfare. What do we think? That economic progress is bad. Notice that they never attack Ireland's argument that social welfare is important because it literally leads to, for example, things like healthcare and education being lost. We tell you that Tanzania literally lost had an increase of AIDS in Tanzania went up 70% because the IMF forced Tanzania to privatize its healthcare industry in order to meet certain international standards. We tell you that it's bad. Why is this true though? Because of all the profit in certain things that I tell you, right? At a point in which you don't care about the people and you care about profit. You literally do not care about the welfare that the government or the company can provide. Under our side, what happens? Government can take tax from the company, right? But government can also literally say, okay, I am taking some chunk of wealth from the company, your assets, for example, and use that to fund other things like hospitals, things like healthcare, things like schools. We think that ultimately the comparative on their side is tax, which is going to be less. But we tell you that at the point which we are able to fund things like social welfare, we make things better economically long term. Why? You develop human resource, again unrebutted. At the point when you develop human resource, you are going to attract FDIs into other industries like tech, like for example, China in Shenzhen, for example. What does this mean? The trade-off on this on the debate is clear. On the other side, you get a small increase of capital to a few select companies, which then goes out because these investors take them all out. On the other side, you perhaps get slower growth, but you get eventual growth because the only human capital, you attract foreign direct investors because of the pool of qualified labor to do the things you want to do. We get long-term growth.
I think the Deputy Leader of Opposition is open the second of the debate. We have to call one member of government.
Opening government have it backwards. It's not the fact that there are corrupt people in these countries already that leads to these state-owned enterprises being mismanaged. It's the fact that state-owned enterprises create the conditions necessary to create corruption in government officials in the first place that is causally responsible for the destabilization of the governments of these vulnerable countries. First thing I'm going to do in this speech is address some extraneous rebuttal directed at opening opposition. So to complete the attack on their argument that this prices out consumers, firstly, it is the incentive of corporations to maximize access to things like utilities in all cases, because the margin of return in terms of things like electricity is quite small, which means it's more useful for a corporation to maximize the number of consumers that it has instead of trying to squeeze an extra cent out of a limited pool of consumers that it might have currently. Secondly, the reason that corporations can obviously do things with respect to things like railways, tier services in a way that make that railway more affordable for all different types of people, in the way that railway services in countries like the United Kingdom already do. And thirdly, these corporations are presumably in these countries for the long haul. If these contracts are profitable, they want them to be renewed. And in order to have people in these countries use your services, you must gain their trust, in which case you must use to have prices that people find palatable. And the other argument is like, well, all other industries in these, this discourages foreign direct investment in these countries, but it's precisely the opposite. The existence of state-owned enterprises in these countries creates incentives on the government to implement regulations that force out other industries in these countries from operating, which is precisely why, for instance, a government that has a state-owned train enterprise, might want to implement restrictions that make other forms of public transportation less viable in that country, for the reason that it wants to protect the profitability of that and to make sure that it is able to continue getting revenues out of something it has invested a lot of time in. Firstly, substantively, state-owned enterprises create corruption which leads to the destabilization of governments. And note that this responds implicitly to all of opening opposition's arguments about capital drain, because our point is that the capital drain happens worse when it happens internally. Why do these state-owned enterprises create corruption? Firstly, they allow government officials to have enormous indirect control over resources that are incredibly valuable, which gives them the opportunity in the first place to be corrupt, especially in developing countries where politicians are not paid a lot of money, in which case it becomes exponentially more utile for someone to be corrupt instead of managing an industry effectively. Secondly, because it gives direct accesses to sources of undue influence, which is why precisely the state-owned enterprise of Eskom in South Africa was the primary vector by which the Gupta family was able to exercise influence over the South African government, because forcing politicians to negotiate things like trade deals or resource deals is precisely the place that allows other private corporations to exert influence upon those politicians. But thirdly, the democratic institutions that opening opposition relies on to keep these state-owned enterprises in check do not work in these countries. First, local institutions are likely to be fragile and lack the transparency mechanisms necessary to hold these companies to account. Secondly, these businesses are complex. Most voters do not understand and cannot track down the trail that might lead them to corruption, which is why Eskom and lots of private state-owned enterprises in China were corrupt for like decades before that was discovered. Thirdly, the reason that many people do not vote in these countries or do not pay a lot of attention to these to elections, because there's little buy-in in democracies that are, for instance, fledgling democracies or that are seen already to be unstable. But fourthly, and most importantly, most people in these countries are single-issue voters and are more likely to vote on issues like the fact that they live in poverty than how well a railway network in that country is going to be run, which means that even at best for opposition bench, and like everyone's cognizant of the rampant mismanagement and corruption that exists in these countries, voters will not hold those politicians to account because they'll vote on parties on the basis of different issues. Why is this most important in this debate? So, opening government is like this leads to cronyism, and that is true, but that is very marginal. Our claim is that this creates networks of people within the state which incentivizes governments as a whole to destabilize and to remove transparency mechanisms that make those governments effective. Because when you give individuals that are responsible for managing state-owned enterprises disproportionate amounts of power, because they have more money, because they have more influence over those enterprises, they are able to influence other politicians around them into creating situations where they allow corruption to occur at a worse extent. But secondly, it creates perverse incentives to charge populations for their corruption, because it's not like Eskom, the populations just run Eskom into the ground, because that means they couldn't keep getting their payouts, corrupt payouts. It's more likely that they do things like raise taxes on the South African population and justify that in the name of saving a state-owned enterprise, when instead it fuels their own corruption. That's the first reason closing government wins this debate. Secondly, they're bad at developing underdeveloped regions. So opening government's mechanism is like, there's lack of political will to develop those regions. That is plausible, but people in those regions presumably still vote. Our claim will be that governments lack the facilities necessary to take out the massive loans necessary to engage in development, and private corporations are far better at it. Why is that the case? Opening opposition's attempt to preempt this is to say, well, governments just raise taxes, but many of these countries are developing countries that do not have large tax bases. Many of them do not even have the infrastructure necessary to collect taxes, which is why that is not the likely case. More often, governments take up large amounts of debt, but they either do not do that when it's necessary, because it's extremely unpopular, people say it undermines national sovereignty or whatever, or developing countries often have bad credit ratings, which makes that debt extremely expensive or extremely exploitative. Before I move on, okay.
On your side, rich foreigners can easily take the capital and leave without any sort of prosecution, right? On our side, these government officials find it much harder to just leave the country like that.
Well, so our point is private corporations have a less incentive to be corrupt, because that harms the bottom line of the business, and they're more likely to be more transparent. In terms of things like capital flight, yes, it is true, some profits leave the country. Our arguments are directed at the point that, this allows a whole lot more investment into the country. So at best, it's kind of value neutral. At worst for you guys, we get a lot more investment. And that debt, and you have to compare that expensive debt to corporations, which are often established in developed countries, which can take out debt relatively easily, which makes infrastructure investments more likely. And governments do not like investing in infrastructure because it takes a long time to develop. So you might lose an election before a construction project finishes, and your opposition party gets credited for that development, which is not something that's likely to happen with private corporations who have 10 or 20-year contracts. Finally, on mismanagement. Problem is, short-term governments have short-term electoral incentives, which means that they're not effective at managing resources, because it's extremely unpopular to cap water usage or electricity usage because it denies people access to things that they want. Compare that to private corporations who must receive a return on their investment and have a long-term incentive to buy profits in the future. That's incredibly important. Most of these countries are resource scarce or don't like to have the infrastructure necessary to deal with things like drought, which is why it's absolutely necessary that we hand over control to private corporations who will most likely be responsible, we propose.
I thank the member of government who has to go on the member of opposition.
Here's the problem with Young. When they talk about these contracts being put up for sale on a very regular basis, on the regulatory mechanisms marched around that process, that line does a lot of work for them in the round. The problem arises when I think a very significant proportion of the world will just not have their contracts bought, because the individuals that would be purchasing those contracts cannot offset the losses that might occur in one region as opposed to the benefits they might get in another region, because they're literally dividing these contracts up explicitly, in the words of the opening government prime minister, along regional or economic lines. Two extensions. First, some areas just do not get investment. Second of all, you produce companies that fail, and when they go bankrupt, everyone loses their provision. Before that, response to closing government. The first CGD's argument is essentially that you have an increase in corruption in these areas. I just think this is a wash in the round. Three reasons for believing this. One, you are giving these governments control over the negotiation and cash exchanges of multi-billion-dollar contracts. So these individuals are corrupt. It's not clear to us why siphoning off a bit of oil is analytically equivalent to siphoning off a few billion from a contract. Notice that the Petrobras, for example, scandal was directly as a result of cash being easier to steal than physical resources like electricity or oil. Second of all, I think you are likely to get, in their own characterization of these regimes being corrupt, which is like a little bit racist, by the way, kickbacks. They give us no reason as to why you wouldn't secure these contracts, for example, via bribes or kickbacks, if the characterization of corruption stands there. Third, I actually think you are less likely to get corruption on the opposition bench, specifically because the electorate know who is to blame if they have a shortfall in the resources that they're provided. The actual reason corruption is a problem is that it impacts the services that people can access. Insofar as that's true, when people feel that their services are being stripped from them, the comparative in this round is, do they need to take up their complaints with a shady European boardroom and a collection of investors that have come together to buy this consortium oil company, or do they take it up with their local MP who lives a mile from their doorstep? I think in terms of rooting out corruption, one is much easier than the other. The second kind of fragments of extension, if they can be so called, we get from closing government, are things like governments don't want to invest. First, I just think this is a very cynical view, and we'll point out the fact that governments invest in things the whole time because the majority of people who go into politics want to improve the quality of life of people in their nation. But second of all, notice that the majority of the way that national companies work, for example, is they still receive significant amounts of private investment in this, below the 50% cap. They might receive 20, 30, 40% in private equity, for example, but the government retains control of what that business does. That takes out a lot of the government argumentation. The last thing they say is governments can't do hard things like cut resources off to people. I think the number of areas in the world that are subject to drought sufficient you would turn someone's tap off is pretty limited. But what that actually means, panel, and what they concede, is that governments cannot get away with just cutting off resources from people who need access to them in a way that a business located hundreds of thousands of miles away does not have the same accountability. First argument, some areas just do not get investment. I think some people just will not buy up these contracts. This is different from opening opposition, because opening opposition say once these contracts are bought up, they have to raise prices above the ceiling or whatever. Perhaps the ceiling deals with that. The key is I just think lots of these contracts won't be bought. 4 reasons. 1, the price controls that are in the opening government model. That is, if you have to charge everyone within a region the same amount, and are not required to provide for everyone in that region, logically you will only build in areas that have the lowest costs. Those are crucially rich areas, and this is where we're adding the actual analysis to this opening opposition, because those are the areas that have existing infrastructure. Those are the areas that tend to be less isolated. Those are the areas that tend to have like a higher portion of people that are willing to pay higher rates. Second of all, they cannot offset losses in these poorer areas. The way a government works is it can balance between regions. That is, if province A is unprofitable, or province B is profitable, it can say, okay, we shift the little amount of profit we make in richer province B into province A, everything is fine. The problem is, selling these contracts off region by region, which is the gov model, means that perhaps some areas just will not be profitable at the price ceiling that the government has decided to set. What that then means is that those contracts will never be bought up by anyone. Third, I think there are perceptual problems that mean that lots of countries and lots of regions and countries won't have these bought up by the international capital that they talk about. That could be because of the credit rating and credit security problems that they talk about in closing government. That could be because that area has conflict within it, for example, between ethnic groups, or has physical security problems like South Africa that mean that people don't want to locate their CEOs there. That could just be that these international investors are often quite racist. They perceive Africa as being a homogenous entity and like ubiquitous in the amount of conflict and the amount of tension that goes on there. Fourth and finally of all, I think there is a fear of repossession from lots of these businesses. Notice that lots of the countries this debate is about, in terms of flip-flopping between nationalised and privatised industry, are countries like Bolivia or countries like Argentina that have a serial history of privatising, allowing private business to buy up those contracts, build the infrastructure for them, and then renationalising it. This is literally what the Bolivian government did in 2012 when it forcibly seized oil fields it had previously nationalised. What does this mean for the round? 1, response to the Gov case about provision of capital, provision of profits. But most importantly, it beats our opening, because when they talk about price rises, I think that is much, much less important than some areas just not getting any investment whatsoever. Second extension, instability within these businesses. This is the most important argument in the round, because we can prove to you that the businesses that you create go under, or go under for like a period of months as these contracts are exchanged. That is not just the poorest not getting their services, that is everyone in that country not getting these services. 2 reasons these businesses are less stable than government businesses. First, they cannot operate at a loss. That is, that as a private organisation, if you make a loss for a period of months or a period of years, like 1, you just go bankrupt, like let's say financial problem with a bank. But more importantly, your investors, your international shareholders, your stock price, investors just start pulling their money out. What does that mean? That means that there is a significant proportion of areas where if they do make a loss, because perhaps they can't predict that perfectly, that business literally just goes bankrupt and you have no services in that area. I can see a government having to bail out a business with its budget is not ideal, but the comparison here is between a government bailout and literally no services in some of these areas. The second reason these companies are less stable is because the contracts are renewed every 2 years. The gov model is that they get accountability right reselling these contracts every 2 years. What that means is that if a proportion of your population happen to be really unhappy, perhaps that could be a very small pocket of your population are unhappy at the moment, but they're very visceral, they happen to be located in politically strategic areas, they happen to take this to the ballot box, no thank you. What that does is it means that like the likelihood of you re-securing that contract the next year might go down. That is like what they fiat into this debate. The problem is, if these contracts are constantly changing hands 2 or 3 or 4 year cycles, the problem that then accrues is it will take a couple of months for a business to hit the ground running. It will take a couple of months for a new investment to come in, to build entirely new infrastructure, to employ an entirely new host of people, to agree a whole new financing package, and in that 2 or 3 month overlap, people have not got access to services. I think this debate has been surprisingly glib on what are nations that have structural problems in terms of their reputation on the international stage, that have structural problems in terms of the distributions of inequality in an area. If you do not allow a government to rectify that inequality, if you do not allow a government to take on the financial burden that running these companies might pose, our extension is very simple. You just do not get services to some areas, and in some instances, you just do not get services to some countries. I think that is intuitively more powerful in this round, should be weighted heavily in the opening opposition contribution, but I would point out it also takes out almost all of the government analysis about prices. We can talk about prices all we want. If people do not have services, that is intuitively more important. Very proud.
I'm going to structure my speech under 2 main areas of approach. I'm going to look at quality, and I'm going to look at access to that infrastructure, and under each, I'm going to compare, on a comparative, what it looks like when you have companies investing, when you have governments investing. Before that, though, I want to do 2 extraneous pieces of refutation. Firstly, We hear from the previous speech that the refutation to our extension about companies not taking up these contracts in the first place, or them failing to provide services, is they can just claim bankruptcy and that will solve the problem. Here's the problem with this. Closing government says that they're going to bail out companies that fail. Opening government says that they aren't going to bail out those companies. We say, under either option that they choose, the world is worse. If they bail out those failing companies, then they lose all of their argumentation about contract renewal, competition, and efficiency because they're bailing out companies that failed. But two, if they don't bail them out, then our extension still stands really strong because nobody ever goes into those impoverished, poor areas that most need access. Regardless of which option you choose, they can't win. Second thing though, very quickly, opening government says, well, how will you ever get infrastructure built when they're super expensive? Like, you just need private investment. I want to highlight one thing that Ed says in his speech, which is we're okay with some degree of private investment in state-owned companies. They just can't be the majority stake, which means that private investors can take 10, 20, 30, 40% stakes, but it still has to largely be owned by the state. So we can still build infrastructure. That being said, let's look first at quality and then access. Looking firstly at quality. The major argument we get coming down from them is under companies, is that when you give companies access, they're going to have greater benefits to those companies because they're likely to be more efficient. The claim that you got from our side is you're effectively giving these companies a monopoly within these regions. There's only one of them by their model. And since they control those regions, they have no incentive to create better quality of goods. We get two mechanisms of accountability down the gov bench. The first one is contract renewal. So they say if a company does poorly, then the government will replace them because if the government doesn't, the population is going to be really mad. First thing to note, this mechanism also works for our side, and I point this out in a POI, which is to say that if contract renewal works because if the government renews a bad contract, they get taken out of power, and that is also an argument for that government being taken out of power if they deliver bad services to the population. But two, here's the critical response though. Contract renewal only works as an accountability mechanism if there is another option to take the place of the company that is already within that region. Ed gives you reasons that opening op never gives you as to why there won't be competition. One, these industries require massive capital investment. Only a handful of companies, or countries if we're talking about China, actually have the money to do things like build railway networks, electricity, airlines, all of these sorts of things. Two, this is critical and Ed brings it up in his speech as well. Even if you kick a company out and you say we're going to renew the contract and give it to another competitor, that company that built on that land owns the rights to everything and all of the assets they constructed on that land, which is to say they own the electricity lines, they own the railway networks, they own the factories and the power plants, and it's up to them whether or not they're going to sell it. And we say most companies probably aren't going to sell it to another company unless they can pay them a huge price that makes it profitable. But few companies are likely going to be able to actually pay that price. Companies just won't sell them. But three, even if they do sell them to another company, it is very difficult for large companies, multinational corporations, to take over where another company is left off, which is what we get from back half government. Why? Because even if another company has already built the railroads for you, the electricity lines for you, if it's a company that failed, they probably did a bad job, which means you have to redo all of it. So you have to uptake it, build your own, invest in it from scratch, and you also have to get all of your staff and all of your building contractors who might have a different way of building things to be in line with the current infrastructure that's already there. For all of these reasons, we say there's very little competition and their contract renewal mechanism doesn't work. Second mechanism they give you, lawsuits hurt the company. This comes out of OG and it hurts their reputation. They don't have an incentive to screw over populations. And this works for companies like Apple, Nike, and Facebook that provide consumer goods. It doesn't work for infrastructure companies. Why? Because countries will always buy from the companies that offer them the highest price, the highest bidding price for having the land. That is their model for the contract, and also that will implement that behavior, those infrastructure at a cheapest cost. So lawsuits aren't a thing, and this is proven by the fact that many countries open their borders to companies like BP Oil, despite their bad reputation. So what does this leave you with under quality? The government is unable to regulate the quality of infrastructure within the states because they know that if they try to regulate them, there will be no other option for them, which means you have them hiring foreign workers, bad quality of infrastructure, all these sorts of things. Next, I want to deal with what they tell you under government. That's the company side of the house. What is the comparative under government? They say governments are more likely to be corrupt on our side of the house, which is why you have bad quality of goods. First, this is an assertion. Just because they say that you have access to resources makes you more corrupt is never a mechanism that they substantiate. Two, Ed points this out, their same governments are the ones that are dealing with multi-billion-dollar contracts. So if they're going to be corrupt under our side of the house, they can still be equally cronyist under their side of the house. But more importantly, doesn't exist. The government doesn't have to collect taxes if they have a lot of resources. So those harms still accrue on their side. But the key differences that we tell you on our side is the government is directly accountable to the local population. And given that in developing countries, a large portion of the population is from rural and poor areas, there will literally be revolts if they do not cooperate. I'll take front half.
Look, just because governments won't cover profit losses, as I said, this does not deny them the ability to carry out emergency bailouts to maintain services while a new company is being found. Therefore, your impacts of the denial of service just don't really accrue in this debate.
So I'll talk about this under access and I'll flag it. Okay, so under quality, what you're left with is the government cannot properly regulate these companies when they mess up because there's actually no alternative source or very few will compete with them. Under access, and this is very important because if poor people don't have access to water, that's a bad thing. Our claim is companies won't enter into impoverished areas in the first place, and this is directly responsive to your point, even if you do bail them out for bankruptcy reasons. Why? Because when you impose things like price controls in impoverished areas where you're already able to make very little money off of people, you have to make up for the massive capital investments that cost billions of dollars somehow. When you're also putting a floor on the amount that they can charge people, it just isn't sustainable for companies to go in. The consequence of that, which is what Ed tells you, is governments won't impose things like price controls. They'll do everything possible to have those companies go into poor and impoverished areas. But critically, those companies are going to have extremely high prices. Why? Because demand is inelastic. Because people will keep buying water even if it means that they go broke because they need to survive. That means that they get away with exorbitantly high prices under access. What is the comparative in this debate? Both governments and companies can be corrupt. The difference is that governments are directly accountable to the people who will revolt against them if they don't have access to water. But those governments are held burdened to big corporations who can buy up all of their power and don't have any incentive to improve or change those contracts when there's no other buyer.
I think the opposition will win, but